I think we'll just start now anyway, and they can creep in at the back. So welcome everyone to our Friday lunchtime lecture series, which has been going on for a couple of months now, and it's nice to see you all here. I'd like to introduce today our speaker, who is Dr. David Boyd Haycock. I've known David for some time now in sort of academic circles, but and I'm sure you'll enjoy his talk today. David's working at the National Maritime Museum at the moment, and they're currently organising an exhibition on the Restoration and Charles II. So I encourage you to go, or to keep your ears out about that, and go and see it when the time comes. And David's going to talk to us today about science, medicine, and the prolongation of human life. So thanks, David.
But yeah, no, it's a great privilege to be speaking here. I've never given a lecture or spoken at the Royal Society before. I have done quite a lot of work here in the past. My PhD thesis was on a chap called William Stukely, and that book's actually in the library here, so they've kind of got that out if anyone wants to look at that afterwards. But Stukely was a fellow of the Royal Society in the early 18th century, and very early biographer of Sir Isaac Newton. But it's nice to be able to come here and actually to speak to you. Okay, so in 2010, the Royal Society is going to be celebrating its 350th anniversary of its foundation. This coincided with the restoration in 1660 of Charles II, following the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell and briefly of his son Richard Cromwell. And as Felicity says, I'm currently working on a major exhibition which will take place at the National Maritime Museum in 2010 to mark this event. And an image that will very likely appear somewhere in our exhibition is this one with which I open. The frontispiece from Thomas Spratt's History of the Royal Society. And Felicity's kindly got some books out from the Society's collection, and you'll be able to look at some of those after the lecture, including the Spratt's first edition of this book and the edition which Spratt actually gave to the Society, as you'll see on the inscription underneath, which is very nice to see. This drawing shows Fate in the centre with the wreath crowning a bust of Charles II, and it's very probably made by the Royal Society fellow John Evelyn. It was subsequently used, as I said, by Spratt as the frontispiece to his book, The History of the Royal Society. As a date will tell you, this was very much an early history of the Society, a history of its foundation and the work of its earliest fellows, just 7 years old. It was a vigorous defence of its early work and its achievements, but also its ambitions. Almost 350 years later, the Society is still here, still with us, still doing what its full title says it should be doing, the Royal Society of London for the Improving of Natural Knowledge. There's certainly nothing to suggest that the Society is going to vanish now, and if human civilization is still around in another 350 years, I expect the Royal Society will still be with us. But its first decades were relatively precarious. It was sometimes touch and go as to whether or not the interests of enough committed individuals would be maintained to keep the Society going. So as is most abundantly clear, the life and the survival of the Society depended, as it continues to depend, on its members. It is its fellows who've maintained the Society through its past 348 years. Each new fellow is a link in a direct chain that stretches back all the way to 1660, connecting themselves directly, if intangibly, with those first men such as Robert Boyle, who first met to suggest its creation. This endless succession of fellows carries on the Society's work over many generations, aiming towards a common higher goal. That goal is a thorough understanding of the world around us and all its many secrets and operations. The man sat on the right of this picture is Lord Brunkner, the Society's first president. This too is a position that is handed down and handed on. Famous former presidents include Samuel Pepys, Sir Isaac Newton, Hans Sloane and Joseph Banks. So what, you might be saying? That's the point of society. That's what a society does. It endures, it has members, it survives. But the point I'm leading to are these, twofold. Firstly, a dedicated scientific community, was a new thing in 17th century England. And secondly, and more importantly for my talk today, it was effectively a deathless institution. Indeed, Thomas Sprat's expressed hope in his 1667 history was, I quote, that the Royal Society will be immortal. This deathless, immortal institution, continuing its work over many generations and many centuries, is exactly what the man on the left of this picture had hoped for. He's on the left from my position, this chap here, Sir Francis Bacon. Now, if the Royal Society has an intellectual godfather, it is almost certainly Francis Bacon. When this print was made, though, Bacon had already been dead for over 3 decades. But, as he hoped, his hugely ambitious programme of work had been continued on by his successors. Knowledge had accumulated and it had advanced, the latter word being the key term in the title of one of his most famous books, The Advancement of Learning. This continuation and expansion of his work was exactly what Bacon had hoped for. In an institution like the Royal Society, the work of many ages and of many individuals is continued over centuries. In the libraries of such institutions, the wisdom of the past is preserved and it is passed on. As the great 17th century bibliophile John Selden observed, by reading, the many ages of former experience and observation may so accumulate years to us as if we had lived even from the beginning of time. A lucky individual might live but 80 years, but knowledge and the work of many ages carried down to us in books is immortal. But is that it? Is it only through institutions, through books and libraries and a succession of fellows, that the work of ages can be continued, carried forward and perfected? Would it not be even better if the life of men and women themselves could be extended beyond the average 70, 80 or 90 years? Imagine what might be done by a healthy, perpetually youthful life that lasted instead of mere decades, but for many hundreds of years. This again is exactly what Sir Francis Bacon was hoping to achieve. One of the models for the Royal Society was an institution called Salomon's House. This was an ideal research community that Bacon described at length in his posthumously published utopian tract, The New Atlantis. The researchers of Salomon's House were engaged in all sorts of great enterprises. Among them were what Bacon explicitly called the prolongation of life, the restitution of youth, and the retardation of age. Now, when Bacon spoke of finding ways of prolonging human life, he wasn't thinking about adding just a few extra years. He was thinking about potentially hundreds of years. Indeed, he wrote a whole book about just how this might be done. Unfortunately, the Royal Society Library doesn't have a copy, but it was titled The History of Life and Death. There, Bacon actually suggested that it might be possible in the future for science and medicine to find a way of making humans live forever. Now, this obviously sounds rather remarkable and preposterous even. How was he proposing this to happen? What was his belief behind this idea? Because when we think of the 17th century, we don't think of people living for many years at all. Indeed, in the 1690s, the famous astronomer and Royal Society fellow Edmund Halley calculated that the average life expectancy of birth of someone born in a city like London was a mere 33.5 years. This may well have been true, but did people in early modern Europe simply accept the fact that they would probably not live for very long? Or did they, like Bacon, believe that their lives could be substantially prolonged? Did they, in fact, believe that there was something very, very wrong with so many people dying so very young? The evidence to suggest that there was a problem, that this wasn't a natural phenomenon, these unnaturally short lives, lay in 2 particular sources. Firstly, there was the evidence around them of contemporaries who did appear to live a very long time. And secondly, there was the evidence of the Bible. I'll start with the Bible because this provided the fundamental underlying framework for Bacon's suggestion that life could be vastly prolonged. The first chapters of Genesis make it clear that if Adam and Eve had not eaten the forbidden fruit, they would have enjoyed eternity on earth. In the Middle Ages, the Oxford friar Roger Bacon had recorded in one of his books, "Man naturally is immortal." Not only were Adam and Eve free from death, they were physically faultless too. According to many early modern writers, Adam was an almost bionic man. Tall, strong, and handsome, he was created by God with total knowledge. It was obvious to anyone in 17th century England that modern men and women fell far short of such excellence. So what had gone wrong? As I've pointed out, he was eating the forbidden fruit, and the fall from Eden had started it all off. In the opinion of the late Elizabethan astronomer Simon Forman, the forbidden fruit had acted like a poison on the bodies of our first ancestors. Adam, as Forman wrote, became monstrous after eating the fruit. He lost his first form and shape divine and heavenly and became earthy, full of sores and sickness for evermore. It was from this moment that death had entered the human frame. Added to this were the cumulative damage caused by such things as eating meat, drinking wine, and having sex. Read the Bible and you'll see that, in fact, none of these activities occurred before the fall. But that's not the whole story. This process of gradual degeneration of passing down our injuries, our poor way of living, and passing on this degeneration onto our offspring took a long time. So though Adam and Eve had forsaken the gift of immortality, they and their offspring had still lived for many centuries. According to Genesis, Adam had lived to be 930 and Noah to be 950. Methuselah, the eldest of all these patriarchs who'd lived before the flood, had died at the ripe old age of 969. Of course, very few people take these figures seriously today. No one really believes, well, it's not very many people believe these biblical figures. But at the time, and this is important, they were widely believed. I can give just one example of this, is a letter by the English philosopher Anne Conway. She was a woman, she wasn't able to go to university, but she was tutored privately by a Cambridge philosopher, and she's very well respected for her philosophical outlook and her knowledge. And she wrote an interesting letter in 1651 to her father-in-law, the Lord Conway, explaining that Adam had been a very long-lived man. Anne explained that Adam was contemporary with his descendants, I quote, for above 900 years. Hence, he'd been able to share his great wisdom with his descendants. These antediluvians, she explained, were further advantaged in their advancement of learning because the extraordinary length of their lives gave them leave to make infinite experiments, and experience is the mother of all knowledge. By experiments, Conway gave the particular example of astronomy. Whilst the antediluvian philosophers had been able to observe the revolution of a sphere whose circuit will not be finished in 300 years, that is, one person could watch these very slow movements across the heavens. Our life, she explained to her father-in-law, will permit us to observe but very few circuits of the celestial bodies. And this was an interesting question in the 17th century. How had a science like astronomy been advanced so much by the ancients when they conceived biblically that the world itself was only a few thousand years old? And this was one of the ways of explaining it, that philosophers, astronomers in the very earliest stages of the world had lived for these hundreds of years, so had been able to make these meticulous calculations. And it was exactly this sort of thing that Bacon hoped to be able to emulate. Imagine what might be achieved by an astronomer with a telescope who lived for 300 years. So one day, Bacon believed, science would again make us immortal, and we would know everything about the world as our first ancestor Adam had known. And contemporary evidence appeared to be on Bacon's side. It wasn't just a case of believing what one read in the Bible. There were numerous examples suggesting that contemporary lives of well over 80 years were possible. It's a common impression that life in early modern England was, to misappropriate Thomas Hobbes's phrase, nasty, brutish and short. But in some ways this is a false impression. Certainly for many life was short. Very many didn't make it out of childhood. But those who survived their childhood could sometimes live very long. Modern analysis suggests that for the population of England in this period, a 25-year-old man had a 1 in 16 chance of reaching his 80th birthday. Some solid few, including Francis Bacon's former secretary, the aforementioned Thomas Hobbes, lived on into their 90s. Sir John Holland, a Civil War MP, was born in Norfolk in October 1603, and he died in January 1701. And at 97, he appears to be the longest-lived Englishman of this era whose dates I can confidently verify. So Bacon was not mistaken in believing that if one followed the right methods, it was quite possible to live well over 70 years and well over a century. He reckoned that there was scarce a village in England that did not have a man or woman of 80 living in it. And he even wrote himself that he'd met a man of 100 in one of his court cases. Old men were very good in court cases. You find them appearing quite a lot because they obviously have this memory that goes back very far, which is useful if you're trying to discover precedents and things like that. But the most famous example of such remarkable longevity in 17th century England was this man. When he died in 1635, it was widely accepted that Thomas Parr was 152. It was the Earl of Arundel who discovered Parr, blind but living a healthy, humble married life in rural Shropshire. Parr created a sensation when Arundel brought him to London to meet the king. And he was displayed in a pub on the Strand where people brought him pints of beer when he wasn't sleeping, which is what he was doing much of the time. Unfortunately, Parr didn't live very long after his arrival in London, and within a few weeks he was dead. Now, an autopsy was quite a rare thing in the 17th century, but the King Charles I, was interested in Parr and wanted to find out a bit more about him. So he instructed William Harvey to carry out the autopsy. Now, Harvey, of course, was one of the most famous physicians in Europe at that time, renowned for his discovery that the blood circulates around the body. Harvey found that all Parr's internal organs seemed so sound, I quote, that had Parr changed nothing of the routine of his former way of living, in all probability, he would have delayed his death a little longer. Harvey thus blamed what actually appeared to be Parr's premature death on the smoky atmosphere of London compared to the fresh country air of Shropshire. And this had been compounded by the old man's sudden change of diet from a simple one of healthy foodstuffs he was getting in Shropshire to this diet of beer and eating the rich foods at the Earl's table. Now, Harvey's autopsy report would subsequently be published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. And it was almost universally accepted that Parr was 152 years old. And further examples would be discovered in the 17th century. In 1670, this man, Henry Jenkins of Ellerton upon Swale in North Yorkshire, died at the even more remarkable age of 169. There are many occasions where I'm finding these things. I was in the Royal Hospital at Chelsea the other week, and they had a portrait of a pensioner there who is the oldest pensioner they have recorded as being at Chelsea Hospital, and he died aged about 120, and they have a nice portrait of him. And then this is just a gravestone in a parish church in Oxford, which is in memory of John Young. He was born young but died old, aged 100 years, and that was in November 1688. So by careful, healthy lifestyles, such individuals as these had vastly prolonged their lives. They could be considered the normal, if albeit rare, lifespans of an early modern man. Indeed, Parr's case was not actually disproved until the 1870s, and it was still being cited as fact in the early 20th century by at least one Nobel Prize-winning Russian biologist. So from Parr's curious case, we can see how it was thought both how lifespans could be extended and why they had contracted so mightily from Methuselah's near 1,000 years. A simple diet was one key feature. Parr cited his enjoyment of garlic and good salop butter, and regular outdoor exercise was another positive activity. And Parr also noted that he avoided drinking wine, smoking tobacco, or contracting the pox. In themselves, very wise ways of prolonging life. So these are all the types of advice for long life that Sir Francis Bacon took notice of and suggested following a few years before Parr's untimely death. But he also had a few rather original life-prolonging techniques of his own. A careful and moderate diet was considered particularly important. But as the early modern medical theory of aging was based on the idea of moisture, and the idea that we're born with a certain amount of radical moisture, which is why a young baby is very, very soft and wet, and why as we grow older we slowly get sort of drier and more wrinkled and grey, and this is this slow escape of moisture from us, and that there are ways of holding this moisture in. Food is one of them. The wrong sorts of food like wine and alcohol, for example, they were thought to be very hot, and they'd heat you up and they'd dispel this radical moisture more rapidly. So one of the things which Bacon took notice of was the phenomenon of flies trapped in amber, and I had a slide of this, but it never comes up, unfortunately, when I transfer my PowerPoint display. But I think everyone's sort of familiar with this, or have seen flies, which we know now have been trapped for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years in amber, perfectly preserved. And this seems to sort of confirm that if there was some way of sealing in that moisture, the body would never decay. So Bacon wanted to come up with some ideas of how this might be achieved. And as he writes in The History of Life and Death, it is manifest that flies, spiders, ants, or the like small creatures falling by chance into amber or the gums of trees, and so finding a burial in them, do never after corrupt or rot, though they be soft and tender bodies. And again, this is why Bacon believed practices like using paint and varnish to protect wood. Again, paint and varnish would seal in the moisture within wood and preserve it. And he was interested by the fact that things like a tree could live and then die, but the parts which formed it could be kept surviving forever almost through certain preservative processes. So why couldn't this also be done for a human body that, and again, things like bones, our bones survive much longer than the flesh around us. Again, if we can protect the flesh, the bones will survive. We need to find ways of protecting the flesh on the outside and keeping us alive and fresh and stopping this decay. And again, as another example supporting this case, it was widely reported that the North Africans, the Barbary Africans, lived for 150 or 200 years, and this they achieved by living in cool mountain caves where they could again retain this moisture. Now, going and living in an African cave was no good for Bacon. This wasn't the way to advance philosophy. You needed to find some way of capturing that concept, that idea, but bringing it back so that we could live in a nice place like London and do our philosophy, do our science, and advance learning at the same time. So he wasn't going to go for this. Let's all go and live in caves. So how do we do that? How could we emulate that process? His suggestions were things like covering the skin with olive or almond oils. This, he reckoned, would close the pores of the skin through which our life-giving vital spirit escapes. And he admitted that this anointing with oils, though it had its inconveniencies, he considered it one of the most potent operations to long life. A more extreme measure he proposed was to take baths in human or animal blood. This would help keep the skin soft and supple. Those opposed to bathing in blood could try milk, egg yolks, wine, saffron, or myrrh instead. Ideally, such a bath would be preceded by a massage and followed by the application of a thick oil or mastic of myrrh and saffron. This would help keep the bath's moisturing heat penetrating the flesh, and the oil would be left on for 24 hours, with the process being repeated every 5th day for a whole month. Other Baconian techniques to prolong life for hundreds of years included purgative medicines and regular enemas. He also advised medicines made from opium, powdered gold, pearl, coral, or precious stones. A so-called Methuselah water, he recommended, was made from crayfish boiled in claret. This, he suggested, acted against the dryness of age. So the modern impression one gets of reading Bacon on the prolongation of life is something like a combination between a modern health farm, a detox clinic, and a Chinese medicine cabinet. But ironically, it appears that Bacon's hope of prolonging human life actually led him to foreshortening his own. So a famous anecdote that Bacon was on a coach ride to Highgate in the winter of 1626, stopped to stuff a chicken with snow. This is thought to have been an experiment to see about preserving flesh through cold. But he caught a chill and he died. And he was only 66 years old. But Bacon's premature death didn't deter others from following his lead. The early to mid-17th century was a hotbed of activity in the search to cure disease, old age, and even death. It would be wrong, however, to attribute this entirely to Bacon. Many Western as well as Chinese philosophers and physicians were interested at that time in ways of physically conquering old age. The strongest advocate of the possibility of vastly prolonging human life was this man, Paracelsus, the 16th century German. He was a very keen popularizer of alchemy. And though Bacon does talk about Paracelsus, he largely dismissed his work. Nevertheless, Paracelsus was very influential on other 17th century philosophers and scientists. And though Bacon, as I say, was sceptical of alchemists, this would be Bacon's era and just after, and the period around the foundation of the Royal Society would be a high point in alchemical researches. There were numerous men and women who sought the philosopher's stone and the powerful elixir of life, the elixir of life that would make humans immortal. It's also the famous elixir which would turn base metals to gold, and those were similar. The relationship between those was quite close, those two ideas. The way that metals rusted and the gold doesn't, it was thought the elixir would have a similar effect on the human body. The way the human body rusts and decay, find the elixir, it will stop that process. Early fellows with a keen interest in alchemy included Robert Boyle and his younger contemporary, the future Royal Society president, Sir Isaac Newton. And indeed, Boyle was almost obsessed with the idea that there was somewhere in the world chemical adepts who did possess this secret for prolonging life through alchemical medicines. But there are also less famous early fellows equally intent on discovering the philosopher's stone. They included the Oxford-educated alchemist Thomas Henshaw. In the 1660s, Henshaw collaborated with his sometime patron and colleague at the Royal Society, Sir Robert Paston, in the attempt to produce a red elixir. They failed, however, and Henshaw felt that Paston had too great expectations of chemistry. He told him in 1671, "I've often told you before, I have no hopes from chemistry, but to obtain an extraordinary medicine which will cure most diseases and maintain a vigorous health to the time appointed." For Henshaw, who went on to become vice president of the Society in 1677, many of Paston's hopes for chemistry were simply castles in the air, but an extraordinary medicine that prolonged life seemingly was not. Indeed, such was the appeal of chemistry in the search for the philosopher's stone to many early society fellows that in 1703 a man named John Pickering made an extraordinary claim. Having claimed friendship with Thomas Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, and a former president of the Society, Pickering suggested, I quote, that this Royal Academy had been assembled by Charles II, Robert Boyle, and other great ingenious practitioners to search for the great medicine. By this he no doubt meant the elixir of life in some form or another. But Pickering did note, however, that the search had been without success. The best example of this failure may be seen in the career of another early fellow, Sir Kenelm Digby. This is a painting of Digby in the National Maritime Museum. Digby's father was one of the gunpowder plotters and was executed for his part in the gunpowder plot in 1605. But Digby got back in favour with the Stuarts, and he went on to be an admiral in Charles I's navy and was knighted for his services. Digby was very interested in alchemy. He believed it was possible to restore youth and even revive the dead. In an effort to preserve the youth and beauty of his wife, who was famous for her good looks, Digby concocted a medicine known as viper wine. According to a contemporary book of chemistry, viper wine was made by skinning adders and then steeping them in alcohol for 3 months. You'd then strain the mixture and drink it on a regular basis. According to a contemporary book, it strengthens the brain, sight and hearing and preserves from grey hairs and renews youth. Unfortunately, it actually appears to have had a bad effect on Digby's wife, and she actually died. And going into elaborate mourning, and in order to avoid a scandal, Digby retreated to Gresham College in London. And there he sought for about 2 years the miracle elixir. He actually appears to have had some success according to his own records. He claimed to have brought the crushed ashes of crayfish back to life. But as England descended into civil war, Digby quit London and he went to Paris. And there he met another of the greatest European philosophers of the 17th century, René Descartes. And we have a manuscript record of his first conversation with Descartes. And that conversation, one of the subjects of that conversation, was the question of the possibility of immortality on Earth. Digby told Descartes, and I quote, that since life was almost too short to attain to the right knowledge of things, he, Descartes, who so well understood the working of the human machine, ought to be searching out means to prolong it. Interestingly, Descartes replied that he had indeed considered this very important matter. And he told Digby, and I quote from a contemporary French account, that to render a man immortal was what he would not venture to promise, but he was very sure it was possible to lengthen out his life to the period of the patriarchs, that is, to roughly 1,000 years. According to Descartes' 17th century biographer, Descartes' means for prolonging his own life, which is what he set out to do, was to have a frugal diet. He ate little but often. He drank only sparingly. He took moderate but regular exercise. And he kept a careful control of his motions, having a love for peace and tranquility. He never allowed his blood to be taken, a popular practice amongst physicians of the age, but one which was increasingly being rejected, particularly by chemists who said it was a deadly practice. And he was also very careful in his choice of medicines. It seems to have been, in Descartes' opinion, that if the body of a man was merely a machine, a piece of divine clockwork, it ought to be possible for the careful soul to be capable of extending its operation potentially forever. Indeed, such was Descartes' apparent confidence in this method of life extension that his last patron, the Queen of Sweden, had the impression he was actually seeking to live forever. Things, however, did not work out so well. Christina invited the famous Frenchman to Stockholm to teach her philosophy, and we have a nice image. Could I get some? Descartes just on the right there, discoursing with the Queen of Sweden in this court that she assembled of all the greatest minds that she could find who paid for them to come over to Sweden to be part of her court. Descartes was reluctant to make this trip, but the Queen was very insistent, and finally he agreed that he would come over to teach her philosophy. Unfortunately, he came in the wintertime, and the Queen wanted to be taught her philosophy at about 5 o'clock in the morning. Descartes very famously liked to lie in bed in the mornings and to think and ponder, and I like to use him as an example for how I do my work. The idea of 5 o'clock in the morning on a day like today is not very welcome. It didn't have a very good effect on Descartes. Like Bacon before him, he caught a chill and he too died. When the news reached London that Descartes had indeed succumbed to death, the philosopher Samuel Hartleb, who was a very important diarist and theorist reformer of the 17th century, recorded in his diary, and I quote, "Descartes' design was to make a complete philosophy. In reference to this scope, he imagined that it was possible in nature to prolong one's life to 1,000 years." Descartes' other friends or other acquaintances were stunned by the philosopher's sudden death. One declared that if it had not been for the foreign and violent cause which had deranged his machine in Sweden, Descartes would have lived for 500 years. An Antwerp newspaper was less impressed, however. It reported on the 10th of April 1650, "In Sweden a fool has died who had claimed to be able to live as long as he liked." The aforementioned Kenelm Digby fared little better, and he died 15 years later, and he was aged only 61. Now, the interest of some of the early Royal Society's fellows in the prolongation of life was famously ridiculed in the early 18th century. In Jonathan Swift's classic novel Gulliver's Travels, his luckless adventurer finds himself the visitor to the Grand Academy of Lagado. The Grand Academy of Lagado is nothing less than Swift's parody of the ambitions of the new science of Francis Bacon and the Royal Society. After visiting Laputa, Gulliver travels on to Luggnagg, where he is asked whether he has met any Struldbrugs, or immortals. It is explained to Gulliver that these immortal men and women are occasionally born by chance and can be identified by a red circular spot on their foreheads. Gulliver cannot hide his excitement at hearing such incredible news. "I cried out as in a rapture, 'Happy nation where every child hath at least a chance for being immortal. Happy people who enjoy so many living examples of ancient virtue and have masters ready to instruct them in the wisdom of all former ages.'" And we hear clearly the echo of Bacon's great project, of Bacon and Descartes and Digby before them, this instructing them in the wisdom of all former ages. But Gulliver is surprised not to have met any of these immortals at the king's court, considering they would make such wise and able counsellors. If it had been his luck to have been born of Struldbrug, Gulliver reflects, he would have spent 2 centuries acquiring wealth and would then have become a recorder of events and the changing customs of the times. He would create a lodge of a dozen of his own immortal brotherhood, and together they would serve their nation with their great wisdom. He would be endlessly entertained by the rise and fall of nations, discoveries in science, and many other great inventions brought to the utmost perfection. But as Gulliver quickly discovered, dream and reality were much at odds. Struldbrug soon wearied of immortality. By the age of 80, he observed, "They have not only all the follies and infirmities of other old men, but many more which arose from the dreadful prospect of never dying. They were opinionative, peevish, covetous, morose, vain, talkative, and as repositories of history, they were useless. They had no remembrance of anything but what they learned and observed in their youth and middle age." So growing old had no benefits for Swift. Indeed, his own old age was a sorry tale of physical and mental deterioration, his understanding in his final years quite gone. He died distracted some 2 years short of his own 80th birthday, but interestingly, quite a lot longer in life than Descartes or Bacon. But despite his early failures, the modern scientific desire to substantially prolong life did not die there. In fact, it has an interesting history, which from my research and which I go into in my book Mortal Coil, seems to show a course of peaks and troughs. Periodically, scientists and philosophers become fascinated with the idea before seeing once more its failure. One such peak was the one I've outlined in the 17th century. There was another in the late 18th century. The French Enlightenment philosophe Condorcet famously recorded his post-revolutionary vision of a future in which men and women would effectively become immortal. The dream resurfaced in the Victorian age and was once more around in the decades around the First World War. Then in 1962, a young American man named Robert Ettinger published a book, The Prospect of Immortality. Deliberately optimistic in tone, Ettinger's intention, he declared, was to show that immortality in the sense of indefinitely extended life is technically attainable, that it is practically feasible, and that it is desirable from the standpoints both of the individual and society. In fact, Ettinger's thesis was simply that we can freeze dead people, and when science advances in the future, we can then defrost them and cure them. This process was known as cryonics, and well, is known as cryonics. And though Ettinger's book sold very well, and there were popular films like Woody Allen's movie Sleeper, which sort of tapped into this excitement about it, not very many people have opted to have either their bodies or sometimes simply their heads frozen for the future. But there is one man who I've met who has signed himself up to one of these schemes in America and has paid to have his head frozen in what he considers the unlikely event of his death. And that is this man, Dr. Aubrey de Grey of the Methuselah Foundation. De Grey lives in Cambridge and is what is known long-windedly as a biogerontologist. I'm just getting to conclude my lecture by talking a bit about de Grey's work and some of the current interest, what has come around again. I mean, if anyone's really paid much attention to some of the sort of articles in the New Scientist, things appearing on TV, clearly this is a time at which we're very much once again involved and very interested in this prospect that we are on the verge of finding a way of prolonging lives substantially in the way Bacon suggested we might be able to. And de Grey is one of the foremost proponents of this argument. And like Bacon before him, his theory is not based around faddish diets or vitamin pills or anti-wrinkle creams that are going to add a few years to our lives. He's talking about potentially hundreds of years being added to our lives. De Grey confidently suggests that the first person to live to be 1,000 years old is alive today. In an interview with a journalist in 2006, he confidently stated, "I think I'll either die of old age between the ages of 90 and 110, or I'll die from an accident at an age so great that it cannot be predicted." And as with Bacon and his early followers at the Royal Society, there is evidence that suggests it will be possible. Scientists working with nematode worms, fruit flies, and laboratory mice have been able to considerably advance their life expectancy. Professor Linda Partridge of University College London, who was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1996, has worked in just this field. And it's interesting, I just checked the Royal Society's website this morning on Linda Partridge. I was pretty sure that she was a Fellow of the Society, and she is indeed. And as it states on the Royal Society's webpage, the hunt for an elixir which granted long life was the stuff of many a sci-fi movie and book a few decades ago. Now, thanks in part to work on fruit flies being conducted by Professor Linda Partridge, the answers to human longevity are perhaps just a few years away. Professor Partridge and her team has already succeeded in extending the lifespans of fruit flies by 20 to 50%. There have been similar successes with nematode worms and with mice, and part of the Methuselah Foundation, it runs a Methuselah Mouse Prize, which pays out money to the laboratory which is able to produce the most long-lived record-breaking mouse. And the human equivalent of these achievements with mice and flies is the equivalent of many hundreds of healthy years of life. I've discussed some of this work with Dr. David Gems, who also works at University College London, and he studies aging and life extension in nematode worms. And he too is cautiously confident. As he told me, technically speaking, it ought to be possible to manipulate aging in humans. The medical research funding body, the Wellcome Trust, takes this work seriously and has published some of the results in its popular magazine. This came out, I think, about 2 years ago now. Aging, it says on the title, Aging, Can We Stop the Clock? And it has some very interesting, just sort of popular articles by people like Partridge talking about the latest research. Now, de Grey is a theorist and activist rather than a laboratory scientist. He's adopted what he calls an engineer's approach to aging, based on what he calls his strategies for engineered negligible senescence, or SENSE. SENSE identifies 7 causes of aging at the genetic or cellular level, all of which, de Grey asserts, are potentially fixable by technology that already exists or is in active development. Sense depends on the periodic repair of the damage that occurs all the time at cellular level, preventing it from what de Grey calls snowballing out of control. Cell depletion, for example, which causes so many age-related effects, may be treated by introducing growth factors to stimulate cell division, or by the introduction of cloned stem cells to replace those lost by aging. De Grey recognises that the hardest aspect in overcoming aging is the problem posed by cancer. It's interesting to note that in more than half of autopsies of those people aged over 85, cancers in some form or another do appear, even if they're not the cause of death. De Grey's suggestions focus on gene and not drug therapy. He foresees a day when it will be possible to repopulate all our stem cell populations with new ones that have been grown in the laboratory and manipulated so that the chances of producing cancers are radically reduced. And somewhat akin to a bone marrow transplant, this would be repeated every 10 years or so. De Grey believes this rejuvenating intervention will maintain the relevant tissues indefinitely while preventing any cancer from reaching a life-threatening stage. These processes, he notes, are already close to being technically feasible in mice. Before too long, he asserts, they will be implementable in humans too. Inevitably, some scientists are hugely critical of de Grey. Though admitting to be intrigued by him, Sherwin Newland, who's professor of surgery at Yale School of Medicine and author of the book How We Die, is sceptical of his desire to prolong life beyond its natural term. In a famous profile published in Technology Review in 2005, and it's from Technology, this is the cover to that article by Newland. Newland observed that many of de Grey's strategies are at best speculative, and he concluded with this observation. De Grey has issued the ultimate challenge, I believe, to our entire concept of the meaning of humanness. Paradoxically, his clarion call to action is the message neither of a madman nor a bad man, but of a brilliant, beneficent man of goodwill who wants only for civilization to fulfill the highest hopes he has for its future. But Newland, like many other scientific traditionalists, sees death as a very necessary feature of life, a part of what makes us human. He considers it a good thing that, in his opinion, de Grey's grand design will almost certainly not succeed. For Newland, were it otherwise, he would surely destroy us in attempting to preserve us. In 2005, 28 scientists signed an article criticizing de Grey and the SENSE program. They declared that it falls into the realms of fantasy and disassociated themselves from him and from all those who were impressed by de Grey's ideas in their present state. But it is certainly an exciting time in medical history. Will these ideas come to nothing? Or will Sir Francis Bacon finally be proved right? Only time will tell. Thank you.